This is Joseph Campanella. Bishop Sheen's spoken and written words are a treasure for God's people of all religions. The diversity of his words reflect his certainty that it is not a unity of religion that we plead for, but a unity of religious people.
One of the most important things when you're sailing is wind direction. You always have to know where the wind is coming from.
In the last couple of installments on this playlist, we discussed that before the Second Vatican Council, Archbishop Fulton Sheen was an eloquent defender of the Catholic faith. But when the winds changed with the Second Vatican Council, he changed direction along with the rest of the Novus Ordo Church. In this installment, we'll look at what Archbishop Fulton Sheen was doing in 1969. On January 1st, Bishop Sheen said, "I have never had a happy day in Rochester, but every day has been joyful." Now that's a peculiar quote, since happiness and joy are synonyms, and you may also recall from an earlier installment that Bishop Sheen claimed that the purpose of life was to be happy. On January 16th, Bishop Sheen fractured his arm and was hospitalized for a short while. He said that he was using his hospital stay to catch up on some reading, mostly theological works, light stuff. Now that's another peculiar quote. On January 25th, Bishop Sheen was taking part in still another Protestant worship service. And he wasn't preaching to them about Catholicism. During the service, he told the Protestants that there's no point in going back in time to remember the differences between Christians and expressing truth. The important thing, he claimed, is centering on Christ. On January 20th, Bishop Sheen recommended enlarging the parish program of home masses. He stressed that home masses should be open to all, and not just Catholics. As we noted in an earlier installment, this program of home masses was a violation of the canon law of 1917. So on February 2nd, the Democrat and Chronicle printed a letter from a concerned reader who pointed out that the Congregation of Rites, along with a commission for implementing the Vatican Council's consistory on the liturgy, had declared on January 4th of 1967 that it is not lawful to celebrate Mass in private homes, except in those cases foreseen and clearly defined by liturgical legislation. Such cases must be considered the exception and cannot be invoked as support for general practice. To celebrate Mass in private homes minimizes and weakens the sense of the Church as a meeting place for the people of God in its wider meaning. Despite all of this, here's a March photo of Bishop Sheen himself celebrating a home Mass. A dining room table covered with a white cloth was used as an altar. Bishop Sheen asked who was Catholic among the 24 people in the living room. When he came to Mrs. Leonard, he said, "I know you're not. We're in your house." On March 11th, the superintendent of schools for the Rochester Diocese charged that a priest who had strongly attacked the diocesan sex education program was totally incompetent to be a pastor. The Democrat and Chronicle termed the superintendent's comments as being unusually bitter. The superintendent added that he would not send any teaching nuns to the dissenting priest's parish for the following school year. The superintendent said that the diocese had a sensible and prudent course of sex education, which was asked for by Vatican II, and the pastor showed nothing but incompetency in objecting to it. A few days later, 700 people petitioned Bishop Sheen to halt the controversial sex education program. The petition was expected to reach the bishop over the weekend. In response to the petition, the superintendent of the diocesan school said, "As far as I'm concerned, it's the John Birchers and extreme right-wingers who are trying to degrade Christian sexuality." A couple days after that, opponents of the sex education program bombarded Bishop Sheen with letters to make their views known. The chairwoman of a mother's group wasn't happy with the lack of response from Bishop Sheen. "We haven't been able to get any response from anyone. All we want is some information," she said. And during that time, Bishop Sheen was in Chicago at a speaking engagement, but his secretary said he had no comment. In April, Channel 21 in Rochester held a televised auction. Among the items auctioned was a ceremonial ring and vestments from Bishop Sheen. We can only hope that these weren't used in any sacrilegious way. After not receiving any response from Bishop Sheen, Catholics from the Rochester and Buffalo Diocese petitioned the predecessor organization of the USCCB to halt sex education in Catholic schools. One individual wrote to the bishops that the parents wished to protest most strenuously the manner in which parochial school officials chose to interpret Vatican II's call for sex education of Catholic children to foist gross and aberrant sex education programs emphasizing an excessive amount of physiological and biological material. In October, Bishop Sheen took part of a televised Friars Club roast of Milton Berle. In September, Bishop Sheen said that he had no plans to retire the following year when he turned 75 years old. And true to his words, his plans were actually to retire the very next month when he was still 74 years old. A young priest said that Sheen stirred the whole diocese just by coming in. He urged people to write about their problems, but when they did so, they got form letters in response. It's unfortunate, but they discovered something not too real in him. The supreme enigma about Bishop Sheen in Rochester was that he had been an activist and an innovator, yet barely accessible to the press and to priests who said that they believed that personal letters were written to them but were actually never even seen by the bishop. In late October, Bishop Sheen went on the 60 Minutes television show and was interviewed by Mike Wallace, and he tried to explain why he became innovative while he was in Rochester. Wallace noted some of the bishop's radical ideas, like allowing priests to choose their second in command and urging the age of confirmation to be changed to 17. Wallace said that some of Sheen's ideas alarmed conservative Catholics. Bishop Sheen admitted that Pope John XXIII had a considerable effect on him, but he also claimed that he remained a conservative in matters of faith and morals. He reiterated his views that the United States should unilaterally withdraw from Vietnam immediately. If the country were to do this, he prophesied, we would have the rest of the world, and the communists wouldn't dare to take over Vietnam. Some YouTube videos claim that Bishop Sheen had the gift of prophecy. The people who live in Saigon, which is now called Ho Chi Minh City, would probably disagree. In November, the Associated Press reported that Bishop Sheen reacted strongly to a suggestion that he had not maintained close contact with his flock in Rochester. He showed displeasure when a reporter noted that some people believed relations between the chancery and the clergy and laity were too distant. "Oh, they do they? Well, there's no answer to that," Sheen said. Meanwhile, at a convention of priest councils, a Rochester pastor told fellow delegates that there had been no dialogue between the bishop and clergy. Father George Cucuzzi, a former chancellor of the Diocese of Rochester, said, "I guess when you're on television, listening to your own theoretical questions and then answering them, it's hard to have a dialogue." Later in the month, Bishop Sheen reflected on his time in Rochester. "I was too young for the old ones, too demanding that the Church introduce the innovations called for by the Second Vatican Council, and too old for the young ones. They don't want advanced ideas to come from my generation," Sheen said. One thing he wanted to do was to bring America the latest developments in philosophy and theology. One way he wanted to do this was to import foreign thinkers, Protestant and Jewish as well as Catholic. In December, the Democrat and Chronicle reported that Bishop Sheen was back in New York, to the television screen and speech-making, which won him fame. The next day, the paper stated that one persistent criticism concerned Bishop Sheen's availability to influential journals such as the New York Times and Time magazine, and his relative inaccessibility to the local media. To the Archbishop, the big East Coast newspapers and magazines were old friends and allies. But local reporters felt that they were being ignored, and while it's every man's privilege to decide what his relations should be with the press, radio, and television, Archbishop Sheen, by too often keeping his door closed, lost many chances of speaking directly to the diocese and community. Well, I hope you enjoyed this installment. I'll be back again in about a week with my final video on Bishop Sheen, but in the meantime, please pray for the Church and a return to all things that are good and profitable.